Hello AS, welcome to your second to last flip learning on psychopathology. So we move through that very quickly. This is the cognitive explanation and treatments of depression. Let's get started. So, cognitive psychologists who study, like I said, as soon as you hear the word cognitive, you want to think internal mental processes. So cognitive psychologists believe depression, which is the mental health need we are focusing on today, is caused by faulty or irrational internal mental processes. So cognitive psychologists don't believe that it's the environment, they don't think it's your genetics, they think the thing that causes you to experience depression is faulty or irrational thought processes. So it's all about the way your thought processes are developed. And then we have two different types of cognitive psychologists. We have Ellis, who we're going to look at first, and he very much felt, and this is a nice little picture of him there, he died at the age of 90 something, I think, so he's doing pretty well, and he looks very happy there as well. He believed that depression was caused by irrational beliefs, and as you can remember, irrational beliefs is we don't make a judgment on it like calling someone irrational. We say they are beliefs that stop us from feeling happiness. Irrational beliefs are beliefs that stop us feeling happiness, and rational beliefs allow us to be happy. And he suggested the ABC model. And these are just the images on the side. So he believed that A was the activating event, and this is two people could experience exactly the same activating event, but if one had rational beliefs and one had irrational beliefs, which is what the B stands for, then they would have different consequences, which is what the C stands for. So the example here would be the activating event is getting fired. Both people get fired. The rational belief is, oh well, the company was overstaffed. It's nothing personal. It's a bit rubbish, but the company was overstaffed. I've got some really good qualifications from it, so I'm going to be okay. And that the consequence leads to acceptance. They're not thrilled about it, but it doesn't impact your mental health significantly. Somebody else, its activating event is getting fired. However, because their cognition, their belief is irrational, they had it in for me. It was all their fault. It's all their fault. They wanted to get rid of me. They always hated me from the start. Then that's going to lead to rather acceptance. That will lead to depression, which is the consequence of those irrational thoughts. Okay. In the booklet, it does ask you to create your own examples. So I'd like you to have a think about your own example. Side one is the rational belief, or whichever side you want, and then the other side is the irrational belief, exactly like the diagram on there. And I will be asking to see those in session. The other thing, and we have to be very careful when we talk about this one, is that Ellis believed in masturbatory thinking. So Ellis believed that there was people with depression held certain beliefs that they believe must happen, or held certain beliefs that certain things must happen, otherwise and that holding the belief that all those things must happen is what causes depression. Okay, so I must be approved of or accepted by people I find important. He felt that was a really key thing. If you believe that is the case, that you must be approved of, accepted by people I find important, then of course at some point that's not going to happen, and that's going to lead to depression. Same thing, I must do well or very well, or I am worthless. So the belief that if you're not doing well, so if there's one test that you fail, regardless of how well you've done on all the other tests, you must do well or you're worthless in this one test. Or maybe it just wasn't quite your day, the topic was difficult, perhaps you didn't do as much revision as you needed. If you're honest with yourself, that certainly doesn't mean that you're worthless, certainly doesn't mean you're going to fail your other A-levels, certainly doesn't mean that you won't do very well in the summer, all of those things. And then the world must give me happiness or I will die. Sometimes in life you can't be happy, and obviously if that's clinical, then that's something that you need to seek help for. However, sometimes there will be periods of time when you're not happy and you don't die. So just to make you aware of that. So that is masturbatory thinking, the belief that these things must happen, and because you believe that, when they don't, that can lead to depressive thoughts, as inevitably they won't happen. There you go. And like I said, activity, create your own example of the same activating event. One person will experience depression and have irrational thought processes, and the other person will not. So anything other than getting fired. Okay. And then we have BECK, and that's BECK. BECK's still alive, again well into his 90s. So there's obviously something for cognitive psychologists to say for the life of a cognitive psychologist. BECK was specific to depression. Ellis was more all mental health needs, but it can be applied quite effectively to depression. BECK, who's done some fantastic stuff, revolutionary. If you could have a look at him, and his daughter's still doing lots of fantastic stuff as well. His model was specific to depression. He believed that biased thinking and a lack of perceived control, so believing you have no control and having these biased thought processes. Now, cognitive biases are very famous, and there's lots and lots of incredibly interesting different types of cognitive bias, like cognitive dissonance, and they make your brain, it's a bit like optical illusions for your brain, they make your brain do really odd things and hold really odd beliefs. So whilst it's not something we cover in A level, it's something that you might want to consider. So these cognitive bias, these biased ways of thinking and the belief that you don't have any control are what lead to depression. And he talked about the idea of negative schema. Let me just change that for you, not So, negative schema. These negative schema, as we talked about schemas before, they're ways of organising thoughts and helping us categorise and understand the world. They are mental frameworks that we use. So if you have a negative schema that was, and Beck believed these could be developed in childhood and were a result of rejection or criticism from peers, parents, teachers, any of those things in childhood. So if anyone had experienced bullying, there's the potential, or poor parenting, there's the potential they've developed a negative schema, and this negative schema is applied to new situations, and they can lead to these cognitive biases. And the cognitive bias that we're looking at today is the negative triad, which leads to somebody being very pessimistic and having irrational thoughts. And this is the negative triad. You've got where you have negative beliefs about yourself, the world, and the future. Okay, so your negative belief about yourself is that you're ugly and worthless and a failure, for example. So therefore, because you think that about yourself, you believe have those same negative thoughts about the world. No one will love me, and therefore you have very negative beliefs about the future as well. I'm hopeless because things will always be this way. So the self, I'm ugly. The world, if I'm ugly, no one will love me. If no one loves me, the future, I'm not going to have a very good future, am I? Quite clearly and understandably leading to depression. So if you'd like to create your own example in the booklet to share in class, I will be asking people about those as well. If you could do that, please. Evaluation. I have swapped the acronym to actually make a word. PICS. You've got a nice little camera there as well. So it's exactly the same, nothing is different about it. I've just taken the S and I've put it at the end instead. So it's just hopefully it's an easier way, and possibly because they're slightly different, you'll remember them. So SPEC is approaches, PICS is the explanations, and REST is the treatments. I've tried to make this as easy as possible for you to remember. So please put a very small amount of effort into, what will need to be a very small amount of effort into remembering SPEC theory approaches, PICS explanations, REST treatments, and that should trigger your memory. In previous years, ASs have had to memorise all completely individual evaluation points. I have tried to make this as easy for you as possible. So, a strength of the cognitive explanation to depression is that it has practical applications. So you've got CBT there, and in a little bit we're going to talk a bit more about CBT. However, I think we've come across it before, or you've called it rational emotive behavioural therapy. So that's the other one. That is a type of CBT, and it challenges our irrational thought processes, allowing us to have rational thought processes and therefore alleviate the symptoms of depression. The issue and debate, this is a strength. It is a strength that acknowledges free will. So what I want you to do is, I'm giving you the minimum information. I would like you now, seeing as you've been in AS level for a whole year nearly, and you've seen hundreds and hundreds of examples of evaluation points, I would like you to work on the structure for these. I'm always here if you're struggling, so come and find me. You know the times when I'm available, but it is now down to you, because in the exam I won't be there. Okay. So a strength is that it acknowledges free will. So what free will is, unlike the behaviourist approach, which believes we just merely respond to environmental triggers, and we look closer at free will in the second year, so the more you know about it now, the better. Instead of just responding to whatever's in our environment, that we have no choice. The cognitive psychologists acknowledge that we have some free will, not all free will, complete free will, but we do have some free will, and therefore that we are self-determining people. We can make our own choices, and that can be good and it can be bad. So you decide how you want to structure this, bearing in mind you could have a however point. So this could be viewed, obviously, as good. I'll just skip to the end one. So this could be viewed as good because it allows these person in treatment and experiencing depression some kind of control. They think, okay, so it's my internal mental processes I need to change. I can work on the way that I think and stop that. Whereas if it's just a biological element, well, you can't change your genes, can you? You can take medication, but ultimately what you're telling someone is they will never be free of these symptoms. Whereas cognitive psychologists are saying that if you work on, develop and change your internal mental thought processes, you might be able to alleviate the symptoms. So have a think about that one. However, it can also feel like it attributes blame. For example, all you need to do, you're feeling depressed, all you need to do is change the way you think. When you think about it, that can be a very, very unhealthy and unhelpful way to talk about depression, because a lot of people are working incredibly hard. There is still a genetic element to depression, so to tell them just change the way you're thinking isn't very fair, and can attribute blame, and it could continue to contribute to their depression. Contrast to alternatives. Remember, issues and debates and contrast to alternatives. Never ever use that as your opening sentence. Use different terminology to explain it. Contrast to alternatives. An alternative is that can explain depression just as effectively, so therefore is a weakness, is biological explanations. For example, Zhang found that low serotonin, which is linked to depression, so having low levels of serotonin can lead to depression, which is a biological factor, has links to a faulty gene within the body. And if you want to show off, if you're particularly biologically minded, or you just like to learn long new words, that is the name of the gene that Zhang found that's linked to low levels of production of serotonin. And of course, so if there are other explanations that can explain it equally effectively, then that suggests, and the cognitive approach cannot explain why there's a biological element, because it's not about people's biology, it's about our thought processes, then that obviously has an impact on the validity. Bearing in mind every single one of these evaluation points needs to be linked back to validity. Okay. And finally, supporting evidence. You've got Gazoilo, maybe, and Terry. Don't worry about writing them, just worry about spelling them. They worked with a sample of 65 pregnant women. So they didn't do a study on, don't use that phrase, they conducted a study that involved a sample of 65 pregnant women, and they all found that those that were tested who were found to have pre-giving birth dysfunctional attitudes or cognitive vulnerability, so they had these irrational internal mental processes, they had these irrational beliefs, they had this negative triad, then they found that was closely related to the depression they experienced postnatally, so after they have given birth. So they found there was that women who had cognitive vulnerability, so those cognitive bias, all those things we've talked about, when they were tested later on, they had they were the one they could identify who was going to experience depression based on those thought processes, those irrational beliefs, suggesting that it is irrational beliefs that impact our mental health and can lead to depression, providing the theory with validity. Treatments of depression, then, we've got that they are challenging irrational thought processes. Cognitive psychologists believe that depression is caused by irrational thought processes, so the treatment is to challenge those irrational thoughts. And one of the ways they do that is irrational emotive behavioural therapy. And so that is a type of cognitive behavioural therapy. So if you think back to cognitive approach, we'll have said one of the strengths is that it has practical applications. Well, and we might have talked about CBT, or you could talk about rational emotive therapy. Both of those descriptions would be correct. So the focus is to change your irrational beliefs into rational cognitive beliefs, rational cognitive beliefs, hence the rational part of the therapy. It also focused on people's emotions, and finally it does work on people's behaviours. So gradually they added more things in. They ultimately added in the emotions because of the focus on that, and they added in behaviours for that reason as well. There's Ellis who worked on this. And this is the DEF model. So you've got the ABC model, and then this is the DEF model, which is the treatment. ABC, explanation, DEF, treatment. So the DEF model means that you dispute. The first step is to your therapist would talk with you and dispute your irrational thoughts, and we'll look closer at that in a minute. There are 3 types of disputing. So they would have a discussion that would dispute them. They would then we'd see the effect of the disputing, which should be to replace those irrational thoughts with rational ones. And then finally the F is for more functional feelings and emotions. So once those irrational thoughts are replaced with the rational ones, then your feelings should become more healthy and more functional. So, ways to dispute the irrational thoughts. So, we've got the activating event, that a friend doesn't reply to a group text, the belief everybody hates me, and the consequence, of course, of that is depression. However, there are different types of disputing. So, we have logical disputing, where the therapist would say, is that belief logical? Does the belief follow on from the information available? So you'd ask yourself that question. Is it logical to think that just because one person doesn't reply to a group message, it's logical to believe that everybody hates them? And does it follow on from previous information that we've got that's available? And you'd say no, it could be that they're busy. Just because they didn't text doesn't mean they hate you. So thinking about the available information around you. So if you're logical, previously they were in touch with you, they were kind to you, they were good friends. So that's probably not the case. Or even if they hated you, other people would still like you. Empirical disputing, is there evidence for the belief? No, they texted me the other day and we went to lunch together. Someone who hates you wouldn't do that. Or 3 other people did reply to my text message. So is the belief logical? Is logical disputing? And empirical, the word empirical, E for empirical, E for evidence. Is there any evidence to believe it? So you're thinking about other evidence. And then pragmatic disputing, which is my favourite and one I regularly ask myself when I display irrational thoughts. Is this belief useful? So maybe so does assuming and obsessing over the fact my friends might not like me help or change the situation? No, absolutely not. So even if it's true, even if the belief is true, is it useful to think like that? No, chances are it's just going to make you feel more depressed and unhappy. So it's not a useful belief to have. And in class I am going to ask you to think of some example. I'm going to give you some examples of activating events and beliefs, and I'd like you to think of some ways to logically, empirically and pragmatically dispute them. So make sure you are confident of those. Okay. You're also provided homework, so cognitive psychologists will send you away and say every time you get a group text message and you start to believe that everybody hates you, I want you to apply the logical, the empirical and the pragmatic disputing to yourself. So you're expected to go away and practice those irrational thought processes, keep a diary of your thought processes, lots of different things. And then behavioural activations. The idea is that people with depression, as you know from the characteristics of depression, shy away from activities that used to make them happy. And they avoid sort of physical activity, which of course is research to suggest that physical activity is incredibly beneficial in boosting your mental health. That's why the behavioural part is in there, because they encourage clients to take part in activities that used to bring them joy, or activities that will make them feel healthier. And we're going to come back to this as in A2 as well, particularly for the humanist approach, but there is also the idea that cognitive psychologists, the therapist should provide unconditional positive regard. This is AO2, it's a bit of an extension, so if you feel like you've got more than enough following the other stuff, that's absolutely fine. Unconditional, but just have a listen, and if you want to get ready for A2, you can make some notes and store this in your memory. Unconditional positive regard. Unconditional, without condition, without criteria. Positive regard, love. So love without condition. So what that means is the opposite of that, conditional positive regard, is I'll only love you if you get good grades. I'll only love you if you're not gay. I'll only love you if you hold this religious belief. I'll only love you if you like if you always make sure my dinner's on the table when I get home. Unconditional positive regard, no matter what you do, I will still love you. Or provide you with positive regard, so affection and things, because obviously love isn't quite the right word for a therapist, whilst it is for other people in our lives. So when you think about, sometimes you're shocked by people who their child might have done some awful horrific crime and they say, well, you can't stop loving them, they're your child. That is unconditional positive regard. Okay. So just that is something that client should provide. Sorry, the therapist should provide to the client to make them comfortable and be able to not be able to discuss their irrational thoughts and feel safe challenging them as well. Okay, and then evaluation. So the evaluation for the treatment is rest. You've got relapse rates, so how many people return to having the condition, well, after treatment, how many people return to having that condition at some point. And we found that the relapse rate was, this isn't too bad. You could, again, have spoken to people who've done both. You could use it as a strength or you could use it as a weakness. So you could say that a strength is that the relapse rate is fairly low. We've got Prellis in 2005, who after 6 years found that only 60% of the sample returned to having depressive thoughts. Depression is incredibly, or can be incredibly difficult to cure, to remove all of those thoughts altogether. So that could be 40% could be viewed as quite a good success rate with no relapses. Or you could say a weakness is that there's quite a high relapse rate, whichever one you want to. And whatever you say however, and then you'd either say however 40% were protected and did not relapse, which is positive, or you could say how 60% is quite a large percentage to have a relapse, and you want to talk about the validity of that, the effect, the appropriateness of it. You could also talk about, so this is really, really key, reflecting on particularly relapse rates, effectiveness, side effects, time taken, all of these, as well as talking about validity, something that would be really useful to talk about. And I'd like every single person to make a note of this, is the impact on the economy. So if you assume that either the individual themselves is paying for the treatment, or the NHS, for example, is paying for the treatment, they don't want to have to, if they want to pay for a treatment that will be the most effective and will be the least likely to lead to relapse, so because it will save them money, because if someone doesn't relapse they don't have to pay for it again, or if it's effective then you don't have to pay for it. There's no side effects. If there's no side effects, then you don't have to spend money treating the side effects, and if it happens very quickly then obviously it saves money as well. So that's relapse rates. Effectiveness. So of course Ellis in 1957 found there was a 90% success rate, and you could talk about why that's good, what does that tell us about the theory, what does that save us for the economy. However, it was done by Ellis, and Ellis did invent or develop the concept of, invent's a bad word, develop the concept of rational emotive behavioural therapy. So does that suggest there might potentially be some investigator bias? People beneath in 2009 found that there was a 15% variance in outcome. So they found that while some people had 90% success rate, there was a 15% variance. There was a variety of 15% success rates over of outcome to many different people, and that was due to therapist competence. So it is so you could talk about the fact that it can be an incredibly successful treatment. However, it's incredibly important that you go to an effective, well-trained therapist, and that's why you could talk about, well, Ellis developed it, so he was incredibly well trained and prepared. However, there might be people who are trying to practice it who aren't quite so effective. If the NHS puts their money into them, then that's wasting NHS funding, because they might not be, the treatment might not be as successful for them, and the relapse rate might be higher as well. Also, training costs money. Side effects, there aren't any, which is very, very good. Obviously, we don't have to spend money treating the side effects. It suggests that it's a more appropriate treatment. Not a great deal you can say on that one. I would avoid that one unless it was like a tag on at the end of one. And time taken, it is very, very slow. Ellis found that the average number of sessions was about 27 in comparison to SSRIs, which are a drug treatment which increase levels of serotonin in the brain, which are, and I think we briefly touched on that, which are work incredibly quickly and are far, far cheaper than rational emotive behavioural therapy. So I haven't shared with you the exact wording of the majority of those evaluation points. It is your turn to practice them. I will either go through them on the board, or I will ask you to do some kind of activity where you get to see the evaluation points, or you get to write them and then get them marked yourself. So it's really important, so you will have an opportunity to see that. However, it's really important you try your absolute hardest to structure those evaluation points independently, or seek me out before the lesson and come and speak to me. You will not be able to escape, and it will not be beneficial for you to escape with the minimum of notes. When you go back to revise, you'll be very upset that you didn't wisely make really effectively structured notes. People with good effectively structured evaluation do really well. People with poorly structured evaluation do not do so well. A2 structuring evaluation is incredibly important. Okay, brilliant. Other than that, this is your second to last ever flip learning video on psychopathology. Well done, and I will see you in lesson.